to make a convincing case that moving towards the unified currency will be demonstrably better for their standard of living than under the current system right now. We should proceed by letting the academics study this for us. Think about it as much as possible. Help us to understand what the hazards and the benefits are before the people calculate whether it's in their benefit or not.
Well, of course, he'll also give you the line that he never ever talked about a North American union, that he's always advocated a North American community. But if you read what he has to say, what he envisages is this North American community would be organized. He would have basically three very powerful institutions that would basically correspond with a judicial and a legislative branch and an executive type branch, which would the executive branch would steer the agenda for the three countries, Canada, the US, and Mexico. You would have essentially a North American parliament to mirror the three separate independent legislative bodies in the three countries, and then you would have a North American court, which would adjudicate on disputes, etc. Well, that sounds an awful lot like a North American union to me. Mm-hmm. He can call it a community if he wants it, but now we're just parsing terms, silly semantics.
It's important to know when you're talking about this subject that nobody here is talking about a political union. They're talking about economic and political arrangements which deepen integration and the relationship, but in which the countries, as in Europe itself, maintain their sovereignty.
We're talking about the virtual destruction of a sovereign nation. Three sovereign nations, the end of a constitution. Sovereign nations can be an obstacle to the free flow of money and goods and labor. And if they can erase national boundaries, obviously that would maximize their efficiencies and their profits. But at what cost? I mean, only the nation state is best equipped to safeguard our individual inalienable rights.
How's your experience been in the European Union over there?
It's rubbish, a lot of rubbish, the EU.
The issues that most people face is employment. We have a large immigration population coming over, and so the UK at the moment in the recession are quite worried about losing their jobs, but other than that, it gives you opportunities that you wouldn't normally get, and travel as well is good.
I mean, from a business point of view, it makes business more effective, you know. You don't have to worry about exchange rates and things like that, but it just seems so remote and far away. I mean, it's over in Strasbourg in France, and we don't really get to hear much about what goes on there. You know, you vote once every 4 years, and then it doesn't seem to change much.
Everything is more complicated and bureaucratic, and you got all these like strange laws that maybe apply in France, for example, that in Scotland they're completely irrelevant, and it just makes life more difficult.
It's a process of harmonization, because you have different social systems, different currency, different quality of life, and I think it takes, in this case, maybe 40 years if you have a democratic process.
Sovereignty as a concept was born in Europe. It was created in Europe. They created the nation state. The Europeans invented it. And through the colonial empire, they went globally, and then they passed the sovereignty notion on to the rest of the world. The Europeans have thrown sovereignty out the window.
Well, the Canadian Council of Chief Executives is an organization whose members essentially are the 150 CEOs of Canada's largest corporations. I think we've seen the concept of national sovereignty eroded in a whole variety of ways. And while it's an important concept, it's compromised by the Geneva Convention. It's compromised by every treaty that any country enters into. It's compromised by the Charter of the United Nations. It's compromised by the human rights laws. So I think we need to be a little bit mature about the concept of sovereignty. I find it amusing when people put sovereignty as in a kind of crystal jar and say, well, this is the ultimate. Sovereignty is the ability of a country to act in its own best interest in accordance with international law and its commitments to other countries. Because really, national sovereignty is one of the tools that we use in order to give democratic expression, because we've got to break things down into a more manageable size, but at the same time, it's a concept to be exercised with a certain amount of care.
Sovereignty has changed so greatly because of the phenomenon of globalization, where all issues become transnational. Whether it's trade, the environment, health, it's all transnational. And so sovereignty has to be understood in a very different way. And at the heart of sovereignty, you have the absolute requirement for deep international cooperation. See, the UN was the first great body that sacrificed, tossed sovereignty out the window.
You can't simply agree to every international agreement just because people say we live in a global system now. We live in an international society now. You have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. The people appointed to head these international groups are appointed by bankers, financiers, and multinational corporations, and not by people with any direct link to the people. So they're not appointed by your elected officials, they're appointed by the groups they're supposed to regulate. The idea of accepting a world that is truly global now, a world where we are interdependent, without looking at the root causes of that interdependence and without looking at the problems that interdependence has caused, is a mistake.
Foreign trade is the key to prosperity. Free trade will bring on a Great Depression.
Hitler had a dream that his big business should dominate the world. He called his dream the New Order. Foreign big business was weakened during the war, and today American big business is the strongest. And they have a dream to dominate the world.
This was not a natural occurrence, and just because we do live in a global interdependent world right now doesn't mean that we shouldn't take steps to mitigate that and to reduce our interdependence so we can be independent and we can independently decide what we want for our futures.
Canadians are saying no to the North American Union, no to the SPP, and yes to Canada's sovereignty.
There are people who equate sovereignty with shutting down the borders, with not collaborating with neighbors, but I think they've got it backwards. I think sovereignty means how do you strengthen the nation? How do you ensure that the people in a nation have access to health care and to food and prosperity and to security? And if that's the definition, then maybe the best way to approach that is to open it up, not to close it down.
I am a staunch Canadian nationalist because of globalism, because there are global banking and financial institutions and corporations that seek to violate countries' sovereignties by doing whatever they want to those countries with or without the permission of the people in those countries. So because of the global forces at play, because of the global banking system, because of institutions like the IMF, like the United Nations, like the World Bank, like the WTO, that wield tremendous power over nations already, we need to defend sovereignty more than ever. All other notions that violate sovereignty, including multilateral trade agreements, take away from us the ability to control what happens in our countries. And that's why sovereignty is so important. Sovereignty is where you and fellow people of that country can determine how you want to live in that country. And without sovereignty, you can't.
I hope you know who Laura Secord was. Yeah. She lived on the American side of the border, and her husband was in the War of 1812, and he was wounded. So she was looking after him when a couple American soldiers busted into her house, forced her to belay them, and the American soldiers didn't know how potent